The night was February the 4th, 1881. Constantinople, a city of minarets and marble, of bazaars humming with silk and spice, of an empire that had once swallowed half the known world whole. But inside the Ottoman treasury that evening, there was no silk, there was no spice, there was only a single oil lamp casting yellow shadows across the face of a finance minister who had not slept in 4 days. His name does not matter now. What matters is what he held in his trembling hands. A document, 31 pages of dense, merciless European legal language. He read it twice, then a third time. Then he set it down on the mahogany desk and stared at the flame as though he were watching something die. He was watching an empire die, not by cannon, not by cavalry, not by plague or famine or revolt. He was watching it die the way the most powerful things always die, quietly, in the dark, through ink and obligation, through compound interest and the weaponized patience of men in Brussels and London and Paris who had been planning this for 40 years and had never once raised a sword. This is the story of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This is the story of how the most sophisticated financial trap in history was constructed, baited, and snapped shut around the neck of a superpower. And this is the story of why, if you look at what is happening to indebted nations right now, today, in this century, you will feel the chill of recognition deep in your chest because the blueprint has never changed, only the names on the letterhead. They called it borrowing. That is the first lie you need to understand. When the Ottoman Empire began issuing European bonds in 1854, the architects of the transaction did not call it conquest. They called it modernization. They called it fiscal partnership. They called it progress. The empire had just entered the Crimean War alongside Britain and France against Russia, and the military costs were astronomical. The Ottoman treasury, already strained from decades of territorial fragmentation and internal administrative rot, was hemorrhaging gold at a rate that no internal tax base could sustain. The European banking houses saw this. They understood it with the clarity that only predators possess when they watch something wounded begin to slow down. The first loan was £3 million, arranged through the Ottoman Bank in 1854, backed by British and French guarantors. The interest rate was 6% annually. That sounds, to the modern ear, almost quaint, almost reasonable. But 6% annually on a loan denominated in foreign currency, repayable in hard coin, extended to a government whose primary revenue streams were agricultural taxes collected in a depreciated local currency, is not a loan. It is a mechanism. It is a machine designed to transfer wealth in one direction and one direction only, and the direction is always away from the borrower and toward the lender. By 1858, a second loan. By 1860, a third. By 1865, a consortium. The amounts multiplied, the terms tightened, and here is the number you need to burn into your memory because it explains everything that followed. Between 1854 and 1874, the Ottoman Empire borrowed the equivalent of approximately £200 million from European capital markets. £200 million in 20 years. And by 1874, the annual interest payments on that accumulated debt consumed more than 50% of all Ottoman government revenue. More than half of every coin extracted from every farmer, every merchant, every toll road and port tariff in an empire stretching from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula was being funneled directly into the accounts of European bondholders before a single soldier was paid, before a single school was built, before a single kilometer of road could be maintained. Think about that. Think about what it means for a government to lose sovereignty, not through military defeat, but through arithmetic. The Ottomans still had an army. They still had a sultan. They still flew their flag over territory so vast that a horse could gallop for 3 weeks without leaving their jurisdiction. But they had already lost because they had signed away the future. Every year, every harvest, every trade route was already claimed before it existed, already promised to men who sat in counting houses in Lombard Street and never once set foot in Anatolia. Now ask yourself this question: what does a nation do when half its income vanishes before it can govern? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because the answer the Ottomans chose is the same answer every desperate government has chosen throughout history, and it is always the answer that makes everything catastrophically worse. They borrowed more. By 1875, the Ottoman Empire was in full financial freefall. The harvest had failed in Anatolia. A drought had swept through the Balkans. Tax revenues collapsed, and the new Grand Vizier, facing the arithmetic of absolute ruin, announced what became known as the Ottoman default of 1875. The empire would now only repay 50% of its outstanding interest obligations. In the language of modern finance, this is called a haircut. In the language of the families who held those bonds, it was called theft. And in the language of European geopolitical power, it was called an opportunity. Because this is the phase that most historians gloss over. This is the moment that actually matters. The default of 1875 did not end the debt trap. It deepened it. Because European creditors did not walk away. They did not absorb their losses and move on. Instead, they convened. They organized, they constructed with extraordinary precision an institutional mechanism that would give them not merely their money back, but something far more valuable: control. In 1881, after 6 years of negotiation, diplomatic pressure, and carefully engineered political crisis, the Ottoman government signed the Decree of Muharrem. This was the document in that finance minister's trembling hands that February night. And what it created was the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, the OPDA, a body composed of representatives from European creditor nations that was given direct administrative authority over the most profitable revenue streams of the Ottoman state. Not indirect authority, not advisory authority, direct control. The OPDA was granted the right to collect, audit, and manage the revenues from 6 specific Ottoman tax sources, including the silk tithe, the salt monopoly, tobacco revenues, stamp duties, the fish market levies of Constantinople, and the spirits taxation. These were not peripheral revenue streams. These were the arteries of the Ottoman fiscal body, and they were handed by treaty and by law to a foreign board sitting in an office in Galata, accountable not to the Ottoman Sultan or the Ottoman people, but to the bondholders of Paris and London. This is what legalized theft looks like at the imperial scale. No army crossed a border. No flag was changed. The Sultan was still Sultan. The ceremonies still happened. The court still glittered. But the actual financial sovereignty of the empire had been surgically removed and placed in foreign hands, and it would never fully return. And now, the masterminds. Because there is always a class of men who understand what is happening before the public does, there is always a layer of insiders who position themselves to profit from the collapse they helped engineer. In the Ottoman case, these men operated on 2 levels simultaneously and with breathtaking sophistication. On the European side, the Rothschild network, The Imperial Ottoman Bank shareholders and the Credit Mobilier Consortium had been quietly reducing their direct exposure to the riskiest Ottoman paper throughout the late 1860s, selling bonds into the retail market to smaller European investors, pensioners, clergy, middle-class savers who had been convinced by a decade of government-sponsored propaganda that Ottoman bonds were solid, stable, and practically guaranteed by the civilizational prestige of the European powers backing them. By the time the default arrived in 1875, the most sophisticated holders had already rotated out. The losses were socialized downward. The profits had already been extracted upward. This pattern, if you are paying attention, will feel familiar. It should. On the Ottoman side, a small class of Levantine and Armenian merchant bankers, the Serifs, who had served as intermediaries between European capital and the Ottoman court for decades, had accumulated privileged information about the empire's fiscal deterioration years before it became public knowledge. Several of the most prominent Serif families converted significant portions of their Ottoman-denominated wealth into European assets and real property in the years immediately before the default. Some relocated capital to Vienna. Some purchased agricultural land in Egypt, which was technically Ottoman but practically independent. Some bought into railway concessions in the Balkans, which were denominated in hard currency and backed by European guarantees. When the crisis hit, these families survived. When the OPDA took control of Ottoman revenues, some of these same families became collection agents for the administration, turning their insider knowledge of the Ottoman fiscal geography into contracted revenue for the new foreign controllers. The lesson is consistent across every financial collapse in history. The people who survive are not the people who were most loyal to the system. They are the people who understood earliest that the system was a trap and moved their assets into instruments denominated in something the collapsing authority could not print, devalue, or default on. The Ottoman Empire would limp forward for another 4 decades, but the financial autopsy was already complete by 1881. Everything that followed, the Balkan Wars, the catastrophic alignment with Germany in the First World War, the final fragmentation of 1922, was in some sense downstream of the debt trap. Because when a government surrenders fiscal sovereignty, it loses strategic sovereignty as well. When you cannot fund your own military without the permission of foreign creditors, you cannot conduct independent foreign policy. When your most profitable economic arteries are controlled by outside administrators, you cannot invest in infrastructure, education, or institutional reform. You become a managed territory wearing the costume of a nation, and the managers are always more interested in debt service than in development. This is not ancient history. This is a template. Right now, as you listen to this, there are nations whose external debt service ratios exceed 30, 40, 50% of government revenue. There are countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, in Latin America, where the interest payments on loans denominated in dollars or euros consume resources that should be going to hospitals and roads and the education of children who have never heard of the OPDA but are living inside its modern equivalent. The International Monetary Fund conditions, the World Bank structural adjustment requirements, the bilateral loan agreements with their quiet collateral clauses, all of them carry the genetic fingerprint of what was done to the Ottomans between 1854 and 1881. The mechanism is identical. Only the branding has been updated. And if you think this is only a problem for developing nations, look more carefully at your own country's debt-to-GDP ratio. Look at what percentage of your national budget goes to interest payments before a single public service is funded. Ask yourself who holds those bonds. Ask yourself what would happen if those holders decided simultaneously to stop rolling them over, to demand repayment, to tighten the terms. Ask yourself how many of your nation's most profitable revenue streams, your telecommunications spectrum auctions, your port concessions, your sovereign wealth fund allocations, are already pledged as implicit collateral against the debt that has accumulated quietly over decades while the political class told you it was manageable. Ask yourself whether the finance minister in your capital is sleeping tonight. The Ottoman Empire had 500 years behind it when the bond salesman arrived. 5 centuries of military dominance, of administrative sophistication, of cultural and architectural and scientific achievement that the European creditors were, in public, still professing to admire, even as they dismantled it in private. The trap did not work because the Ottomans were primitive or naive. It worked because debt, when it accumulates across multiple administrations, when it is managed by different finance ministers serving different political masters across different decades, creates a slow catastrophe that no single decision-maker can fully see or fully own. Each borrowing seemed rational at the moment it was made. Each loan solved an immediate crisis. And each one tightened the noose by precisely the increment that the lenders had calculated it would. That is the architecture of the debt trap. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive with cannons. It arrives in the form of a banker with a polished proposal and a solution to your immediate liquidity problem. And by the time the full cost becomes visible, the contract has already been signed in a dozen languages and registered in courts on 3 continents. So, what survived? What can history tell us about the strategies that actually protected private wealth when the imperial fiscal structure collapsed around it? 3 categories of assets emerged consistently intact on the other side of the Ottoman collapse. The first was land, specifically agricultural land outside the direct administrative reach of the collapsing central authority. Families who held deeded property in peripheral regions, in Anatolia, in the Syrian interior, in the agricultural zones of what would become modern Iraq, retained something tangible when the paper instruments evaporated. The second was commodity inventories. Merchants who held physical goods, silk, grain, copper, olive oil, in warehouses they physically controlled, had something to trade in the chaos that followed fiscal collapse when currency values became meaningless and credit instruments became worthless. The third was foreign denomination. Wealth held in accounts or instruments denominated in currencies issued by solvent foreign authorities, in pounds, sterling, in French francs, in the coin of nations that were not defaulting, retained its purchasing power even as the Ottoman currency entered a spiral of debasement that would continue until the empire ceased to exist. These 3 categories are not accidents of Ottoman history. They appear in the autopsy of every major financial collapse in the modern era. Real assets in jurisdictions outside the imploding authority, physical commodity holdings, and currency or instruments denominated in something that cannot be defaulted on by the collapsing entity. The families and institutions that had moved their wealth into these categories before 1,875 survived. Some of them thrived. The ones who stayed loyal to Ottoman paper, who believed the official assurances, who trusted the finance minister's projections, were wiped out. Share this video with one person you care about because this warning is too critical to keep hidden. The Ottoman debt trap was not a one-time anomaly. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration conducted at imperial scale that it is possible to extract the fiscal sovereignty from a powerful nation without violence, using only the mathematics of compound interest and the slow patience of creditors who think in decades while governments think in election cycles. The bankers of 1854 are gone. But the blueprint they left behind has been copied, refined, and applied in every corner of the world in every generation since. The names change, the interest rates are updated, the institutional wrappers are rebranded, but the mechanism is the same, and the outcome, when the trap closes, is always the same. One class of people moves their assets before the collapse. Everyone else learns what happened afterward, usually from historians, usually too late. The Ottoman Empire did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it was indebted. And debt, in the hands of patient creditors with legal structures and diplomatic backing and no sentimental attachment to the entity they are extracting from, is more powerful than any army that was ever raised in the history of human conflict. Remember that. Write it down somewhere. And then look at the numbers your own government is publishing right now and ask yourself very quietly whether the blade is already in the ledger. If this investigation opened a door you did not know existed, subscribe to the channel archive. There is a full library of financial autopsies waiting for you. Each one a different empire, a different trap, a different set of masterminds, and always the same pattern running underneath.